Being a woman on the internet, sometimes you're inadvertently drawn into arguments that you don't necessarily give a shit about, purely because the opposing side is so incredibly stupid that letting it go feels kind of impossible. This is usually about topics where the answer seems fairly obvious, like whether or not you, a woman, can enjoy sport, or whether or not you, a woman, truly understand the magic of cinema. Or whether you, a woman and a self professed fan of a band, can really be a fan of the band in question because you haven't listened to their first extremely obscure and frankly not very good album, released under a different name a year and a half before their official debut and with a different lead singer. It is, of course, always possible to not get into an argument on the internet, but sometimes you don't want to. Sometimes it's so infuriating to be condescended to about things that you've expressed a passion for, or even just a passing interest in, that you would rather have your notifications flooded with 3,000 4chan idiots calling you a stupid slut than back down. Recently, there have been a spate of female led remakes or reboots of classic films that have inspired the ire of this specific brand of man on the internet. I think the Ghostbusters reboot is probably the shining example of this. The trailer immediately became one of the most disliked movie trailers on YouTube, fueled by griping man-children worried that the 1984 classic was somehow going to be disrespected by, and I'm quoting the comments section here, shoehorning PC culture in where it doesn't belong. The pushback against a pretty average trailer, a good cast, and a promising list of cameos seemed so ridiculous to me that I got drawn into internet arguments about this shit. It's not the hill I wanted to die on, but I ended up there anyway. I feel like enough time has passed now that we can talk about female-led remakes in a sane and sensible fashion. Or at least I will do it on this podcast, which does not allow space for people to argue with me. You just have to listen to my opinion. Sucked in. I'm Alex, this is Pop Culture Boner, the podcast edition, and today I'm thinking about all-girl remakes of cult classics. So when I'm thinking about female-led reboots, I actually have three specific pieces of media in mind. They are the aforementioned Ghostbusters, which was released in 2016, Ocean's 8, which was released in 2018, and finally the TV reboot of High Fidelity, which was released this year. The argument around these types of remakes is usually really stupid, in the sense that the man babies making the arguments against them on their cinema blogs and YouTube channels do so in such a way that dances around the thing that they really don't like. It's women, in case you were wondering. But they layer that under some waffle about the integrity of the original. The misogynistic dog whistle, of course, becomes blindingly apparent when you read the comments section of the posts in question. And that's really frustrating, because when the argument is that rooted in misogyny, I feel obligated to love the films regardless of their quality. Hell, I'll go and see him twice if it makes a 38-year-old man with a framed Ghostbusters poster in his bedroom mad. So, if you're mad about these films being made at all, then there's nothing to see here. They're perfect. I love them. Turn off this podcast. Alright, now that we've got that out of the way, and it's only you reasonable folk left, let's talk reboots. What I wanted to talk about when I go over these movies is actually twofold. I want to first look at the weird additional pressure these films generate for women to respond to them positively. I sort of touched on it in the intro, but given the unreasonably huge backlash that these types of reboots receive online, it can be really hard to pass judgment in a way where you're actually just responding to the media itself and not the toxic pool of babies having a meltdown about whether or not women can feasibly run jewel heists or bust ghosts or whatever. And that seems worth unpacking in more detail. The second thing is whether or not they're any good. It may surprise you to learn that this question applied to three different pieces of media doesn't actually have a blanket answer. It's almost like they vary greatly in tone, content, and quality. But I do think one is more successful than the others, so I want to think about why. So let's get into it. Remaking beloved cinematic properties is not like a new thing. Hollywood loves to grab an old, successful formula and squeeze any remaining life out of it, and then put it back on the shelf for another 5 to 10 years before they get to try again. This has mixed results. Like, all you need to do is line up every Batman version side by side to see that some directorial visions are stronger than others. Or, like, some directorial visions are too strong. Just too strong. And too focused on the nipples on the Batsuit. Anyway, the remake isn't new, and neither is introducing female leads into roles that were previously written for and played by men. People do it with Shakespeare adaptations all the time. But even newer releases have undergone this treatment. Karate Kid's sequel has Hilary Swank as the newest Karate Kid. American Psycho has like a truly terrible sequel where the serial killer is played by Mila Kunis. But you didn't really hear about hordes of cinephiles up in arms about these attempts at drawing blood from a stone. Not so with Ghostbusters. Even before it was released, fans of the original iteration of the film spammed the IMDb page to rate it 1 out of 10, and disliked the trailer so much on YouTube that they set a record. I checked today, it has 1.1 million dislikes. For contrast, Rogue One, which is the Star Wars film that came out in the same year and has a similarly rabid nerd fan base, has about 12,000 dislikes. Screen Crush did a breakdown of the stats for IMDb users rating the movie, which showed, probably unsurprisingly to anyone who's ever been a woman attempting to enjoy a piece of media in the vicinity of a Wi-Fi connection, that the overwhelming majority of voters were men, and that the average rating they were providing in comparison to their female counterparts was significantly lower. They were pissed, to put it bluntly. But why were they being so goddamn loud about it all of a sudden? I think it has a lot to do with timing. Ghostbusters, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, was one of the first major studio franchise properties to change out its male leads in a post-Gamergate world. For those of you who don't remember or somehow managed to miss Gamergate, it was an online movement that started off as a misogynistic doxing campaign against video game developer Zoe Quinn, and somehow spiraled out into this all-out brawl about efforts to diversify the content of video games, amongst other things. It kicked off in around 2014, and I think just due to the scope of people that were involved, a cast of thousands that included everyone from game developers to large companies to minor celebrities, and the intense vitriol that kind of came with it meant that it garnered quite a bit of mainstream attention outside the usual outlets that cater to tech and gaming. It triggered broad scope conversations about the diversity of game content and media, with particular focus on the fact that women were underrepresented from both a content and a development perspective. It really upset gamers. You can't see me, I'm doing air quotes. But they felt that their supposedly politics-free pastime was being hijacked by some sort of social justice narrative. What does this have to do with a movie, you ask? Well, I think the Gamergate narrative really highlighted two things. Number one, it was the very real and present desire for women and minorities to be represented in different types of media. And number two, the anger and entitlement of the self-proclaimed nerdy men who felt a sense of ownership over that type of content. I think the production of Ghostbusters with only leading ladies is a conscious decision to reflect some of the desires for women to see themselves on screen in new ways. And I think the severity of the backlash it received had a lot to do with the threat perceived by men who felt that sci-fi comedy was something that formed part of their nerd identity. Being the first and also the most entrenched in a kind of nerd culture that was allegedly under attack, Ghostbusters seems kind of bound to cop it in hindsight. And it really did cop it. Beyond the coordinated attacks on the film's ratings that I mentioned, the misogyny and racism that befell that movie drove one of the stars, Leslie Jones, off Twitter completely. Similar treatment would later come to The Last Jedi star Kelly Marie Tran about a year later when she signed on for the Star Wars franchise. The other two reboots that I want to talk about, Ocean's 8 and High Fidelity, managed to largely avoid this, I think partially because they're not tentpole titles for geek culture. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter explaining why there was less backlash against Ocean's 8, USC Annenberg professor Sarah Bennett Weiser points out that the self-identified geek audiences tend to be very, change resistant. She goes on to say the following, and I'm quoting here. The audiences for those movies, meaning like Star Wars and Ghostbusters, are now adult men, and they had a particular impact on them as adolescents and teenagers growing up. Ocean's 8 doesn't have that. Or to put it perhaps more simply, in the lingo of one of the geeks in question, here's a quote from a 4chan message board, just to give you a little taster of what we're dealing with. Probably won't see it, but since menstruating all over Ocean's 11 doesn't ruin my childhood, I ain't mad about it. But even if the subsequent reboots don't face the enormous online backlash that poor Ghostbusters did, the pressure for these movies to succeed is astronomical. They're seen by studios as a kind of test run for continuing to make other films in the same vein. So if a female-led Ghostbusters isn't going to be a commercial success, then how can we expect to be allowed to have any other screwball sci-fi comedies with women in them? Or heist movies with women in them? Or action movies? Or spy movies? If audiences allegedly don't want it, then it's not going to be made. And that sucks. Especially when you consider how many bad movies we get with men at the helm that are also commercial flops. I've seen about 900 adaptations of Robin Hood in my 30 years of life, and the only one that's been any good has been Mel Brooks' Men in Tights. And yet they keep fucking making them, because having men lead blockbusters is seen as a neutral choice. It's really easy for me to be kind of cynical about how useful actually just seeing more women in leading roles is, but then I remember how excited I was when I saw Charlie's Angels for the first time. And it wasn't because of Drew Barrymore or Lucy Liu. Sorry, Cameron. It was because I was 10 and there were girls on motorcycles doing karate, and I'd been watching old action movies with male leads forever. The film has its problems, but I really did just think it was so cool. So I can only imagine how cool it would be to be a little girl now and see Ghostbusters. But an acknowledgement of these films as somehow useful creates this weird pressure on female audiences to like these types of films, or at the very least pay to go see them. On the one side, if you don't, who knows when you'll get to see it again. It's a little bit like going to see a friend who you like but is very fragile, and they've made you a carrot cake, and you don't like carrot cake that much. And if you're being honest, it looks a little bit undercooked. But they put it in front of you and they say, I'm learning to cook, and I know you like cake, so I made this especially for you. And you eat the whole thing, even though you don't really want to, because the net positive of keeping that friendship is probably greater than the negative impacts of you having to tolerate undercooked carrot cake. You know? You know what I'm saying? Anyway. On the other side, you're confronted with a bunch of entitled man-children yelling about how you couldn't possibly understand this type of movie because you're a woman. Like I said, sometimes you just snap. Sometimes you're just I didn't think the hill that I would die on is that I understand a joke about ghost slime. But here we are. So when I talk about these films, I find myself speaking really carefully about them, because I want there to be more of them. If Hollywood is truly going to insist on squeezing every last drop of life out of existing movie franchises, you bet your sweet ass I want there to be women heading up at least a few of them. I think we've earned it, you know? But then I did say at the beginning of this I wanted to talk about whether or not I actually thought any of these recent remakes were any good. Writing for the New York Times, Amanda Hess frames the recent trend towards female reboots as being somehow corrective. She says, these reboots require women to relive men's stories instead of fashioning their own. And they're subtly expected to fix these old films, to neutralize their sexism and infuse them with feminism, to rebuild them into good movies with good politics as well. They have to do everything the men did except backwards and with ideals. I do agree to an extent. I think Ghostbusters particularly has a fair bit that it needs to clean up from the original script. When you think about it with rose-tinted goggles, you tend to forget that it contains a ghost blowjob and a leering Bill Murray's supposedly charming come-on to Sigourney Weaver. And for what it's worth, I think that the 2016 Ghostbusters has a really sharp and funny script, and in a lot of ways feels more focused than its predecessor. It's directed by Paul Feig, who did Bridesmaids, and you get similar kind of zippy one-liners rattling between characters at a blink and you'll miss it speed. But there is something kind of corrective about it. They're not just fighting ghosts, but institutions that won't support them as well. Ocean's 8 had admittedly less 80s sex comedy vibes to fix, but the catch cry for Debbie Ocean to pull together an all-girl heist team is, "Men get noticed, women don't, and for once, we don't want to be noticed." Which is like kind of silly when you think about a heist movie where the point is to move stealthily regardless of gender. It feels like the kind of nod to ready-made wokeness that Hess is referring to. Having said that, the problem with Ocean's 8 is actually just that the script vastly underutilizes its extremely talented cast. All the problems are fixed as they arise, so there's none of the grand reveal that really makes Ocean's 11, and none of the relationship building that made the original trilogy so fun. Which brings me to the success of High Fidelity. I realize that it's less of a ubiquitous cultural product for a lot of people than, say, like Ghostbusters or Ocean's 11, so I'll give you the benefit of a quick plot recap. Based on the 1995 novel of the same name, High Fidelity came out in 2000 and starred John Cusack as Rob, a grumpy, aging record store owner in the midst of trying to understand why he was dumped by his current girlfriend by revisiting his past heartbreaks. It leans heavily on Rob's propensity to make top 5 lists of both the pop cultural products he worships and the aspects of his love life. In 2020, Rob is played by Zoe Kravitz, and her offsiders at Championship Vinyl have changed from Barry and Dick to Charisse, a black woman played by Davine Joy Randolph, and Simon, a gay man played by David H. Holmes. I think what made the remake so worthwhile to me is that despite the updates, the core of Rob's character remains the same. Which is to say that she sucks! The John Cusack version sucked too. Both iterations of Rob are self-absorbed music fetishists who treat their friends badly and hurt everyone they come into contact with. They're both completely insufferable. But I gotta say, it's kind of nice to see a woman suck on screen. And not in the way that we usually let women suck, where they're sort of like catty or competitive or manipulative, but sucking in the way that men are always allowed to, where she's judgmental and elitist and bad with her feelings. Like, don't worry, there's a redemption arc, and it's much more thoroughly articulated than it was in the 2000 film, but boy, is it nice to see her be awful. I realize that desperately wanting to see women be kind of terrible on screen is a somewhat controversial opinion. So I spent a lot of time reading reviews of High Fidelity from other women, and the jury does seem to be pretty kind of split down the middle. Some find it pointless to reanimate something that was ultimately kind of shitty to women the first time around. And others seem to really enjoy seeing Rob flex her musical knowledge on the kind of obnoxious white dudes that the first film did its best to make seem cool. Personally, there's something that feels realistic about that to me. Rob isn't corrective. She isn't even all that nice. She's just kind of trying to work it out. And same, to be honest. Well, that's a chunk of my thinking on female-led reboots. I actually have probably revealed too much about myself as a person by demanding that more women be utterly insufferable in a very specific way on screen. Validate me and my choices! Anyway, if you want to go all High Fidelity on me, let me know your top 5 Desert Island records next time you see me at the pub.